The call came at 01 for 5 hours Kandahar time. I was in the middle of reviewing intel reports when my communications specialist, Private First Class Rodriguez, handed me the encrypted satellite phone. Expression on his face told me everything. I needed to know before I even heard the voice on the other end. David. My sister Karen's voice came through the static, thick with what sounded like tears but felt like something else entirely. Grandpa died this morning. I set down my pen and focused entirely on her words. Outside our forward operating base, the familiar sounds of Afghanistan continued their nightly symphony, generators humming their constant rhythm. Armored vehicles moving along predetermined routes, the distant chatter of soldiers pulling guard. Duty on the perimeter. When's the memorial service? I asked, already mentally calculating flight times, logistics, the complex dance of military emergency leave procedures. That's what I'm calling about. Karen's voice shifted, became more formal, more distant. The family held a meeting tonight. All of us. Mom, Dad, Uncle Robert, Aunt Susan, everyone. Something cold settled in my stomach. A meeting about what? About whether you should come home for the funeral. The words hit me like an IED. Blast, sudden, devastating. The kind of impact that leaves you wondering if you're still intact, while everything around you falls apart. We took a vote, she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. We decided unanimously that it would be better for everyone if you stayed in Afghanistan. I stared at the tactical map spread across my desk. Red pins marking Taliban positions. Blue pins for coalition forces. Green pins for supply routes. Everything organized, everything under control, everything making perfect sense. Everything except this conversation. You've been deployed for 14 months, David. 14 months without coming home once. You missed Grandpa's 85th birthday. You missed his surgery when he had that heart attack. You missed Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving. Every important family event for over a year, I'm deployed, serving my country. You're hiding, Karen said, and her voice turned sharp. You're using the military as an excuse to avoid family responsibilities. Grandpa kept asking where you were, why you never visited, why you never called. We had to keep making excuses for you. I called every Sunday. 5-minute conversations aren't enough, David. He needed you here. He needed his grandson, not some soldier who treated family like a duty roster. I closed my eyes and tried to process what she was saying. What exactly are you telling me? Telling you that you failed him? Failed as a grandson? Chose your precious army career over the man who raised you? You want to be a soldier more than you want to be family. That's not true, isn't it? When's the last time you took leave? When's the last time you came home for longer than a week? When's the last time you put family first? I wanted to explain about deployment cycles, about mission requirements, about the reality of military service. But Karen wasn't finished. Family thinks no. The family knows that it would be hypocritical for you to show up now, after missing everything that mattered. After choosing duty over love. After letting an old man die thinking his grandson had abandoned him. He didn't think that, did David? He absolutely did. Spent his last months asking why you didn't care anymore. Why you'd rather be a soldier than a grandson. We're not going to let you turn his funeral into some kind of redemption story. The line went quiet except for the static. I could hear voices in the background, other family members. It's probably all nodding in agreement with Karen's assessment of my character. The funeral is Thursday, she said finally. Karen, we've made our decision. You made yours a long time ago. Stay in Afghanistan. Stay with your soldiers. Stay with whatever's more important to you than family. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone for a long moment, listening to the empty static, before handing it back to Rodriguez. Everything okay, Sergeant? He asked. Fine, I said. Just family stuff. Then I picked up my pen and went back to reading intelligence. Reports like nothing had happened. I ate breakfast with my platoon the next morning. Scrambled eggs that tasted like cardboard, coffee that could strip paint, and conversations about home that felt like razor blades in my chest. My soldiers talked about their families, their plans for leave, their excitement about going home. I nodded at appropriate moments, asked follow-up questions, played the role of the concerned platoon Sergeant. Nobody knew my grandfather had died. Nobody knew I'd been banned from his funeral. Nobody knew that in 3 days, they'd bury the man who'd raised me while I sat in a desert compound 8,000 miles away, pretending my world hadn't just collapsed. The weight of it settled somewhere between my sternum and my spine. Not pain exactly, more like a fundamental shift in how gravity worked. Everything felt heavier. Every step required more effort. Every breath took concentration. During the morning briefing, I listened to intelligence. Reports about Taliban troop movements in the Helmand province. I asked tactical questions about patrol routes and supply convoys. I approved duty rosters and equipment requisitions. I did my job because that's what soldiers do, especially platoon sergeants. We function regardless of personal circumstances. Sergeant. First Class Williams asked if I was feeling all right. I told him I was fine, just tired. The truth was more complicated. I was functioning on muscle memory, going through the motions of leadership, while my mind processed the reality that my family had written me off as a failure. At 1300 hours, I walked the perimeter with my squad leaders. We discussed defensive positions, communication protocols, emergency procedures, all the things that keep soldiers alive in hostile territory, all the things that matter when you're responsible for other people's lives. At 1800 hours, I sat in my quarters and stared. At the wall, my grandfather was dead. My family thought I'd failed him. The funeral would happen without me. And tomorrow, I'd get up and do it all again, because that's what soldiers do. We serve, we sacrifice, we carry on. Even when carrying on feels impossible. My grandfather was a World War II veteran, Pacific Theater, 1st Marine Division, Okinawa. He never talked about the fighting much, but he kept his dress blues in perfect condition and his medals in a wooden box on his bedroom dresser. When I was 7 years old, he let me try on his cover. It was too big for my head, but he smiled and said I'd grow into it someday. Military service is about honor, he told me once when I asked about his medals. It's about doing what's right, even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult. When my parents divorced, I was 11. Dad moved to Phoenix to start over. Mom began working double shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. Karen, 5 years older than me, started running with the wrong crowd and eventually dropped out of high school. Through all the chaos, all the uncertainty, Grandpa's house remained constant. Sunday dinners at his kitchen table. I'll help with homework at that same table. Fishing trips to the creek behind his property. Lessons about responsibility, about commitment, about what it means to be a man of your word. He taught me to shoot with his old Springfield rifle. Taught me to change oil in his pickup truck. Taught me that a handshake was a contract and a promise was sacred. Most importantly, he taught me that some things are worth fighting for, even if fighting means sacrifice. Your great-grandfather served in World War I, he'd say, showing me faded photographs of men in uniform. I served in World War II. Your father chose a different path, and that's his right. But I suspect you'll serve someday. It's in your blood. When I enlisted. At 18, he drove me to the military entrance processing station. Shook my hand like I was already a soldier. Make me proud, son, he said. Serve with honor. Remember that duty isn't just about following orders. It's about doing what's right, even when nobody's watching. Boot camp at Fort Benning was 13. Weeks of controlled hell, but I thought about his words every day. His letters came every week, short notes about the weather, about Karen's latest crisis, about how proud he was of me. I kept every single one. My first deployment was Iraq in 2004. I called him every Sunday at 1400 hours Baghdad time, 700 hours back home. He never complained about the early hour, never missed a call. He'd ask about my soldiers, about the mission, about whether I was taking care of myself. He never asked about the danger, never asked me to be careful. He understood that worry was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. A good leader takes care of his men first, he'd remind me. Everything else is secondary. You watch out for your soldiers, and they'll watch out for you. By my second deployment, I was a staff sergeant with real responsibilities. 32 soldiers under my command. Real decisions about real lives. The calls home got shorter, less. frequent, the family got busier with their own lives. Mom remarried a man named Frank who didn't understand military service. Karen had her first child and struggled with single motherhood. Dad started a new business and a new family in Arizona. Everyone had their own problems, their own priorities. I understood that. I accepted it. But I should have paid closer attention to the subtle changes in Grandpa's voice during our calls. The way he'd pause before asking about my plans to come home. The way he'd mention family events I'd missed. Not as criticism, but as gentle reminders of what I was sacrificing for my service. I should have read between the lines when he stopped asking about my promotion prospects and started asking about my happiness. Should have recognized the concern in his voice when he'd say, "The Army's lucky to have you, son. But don't forget you've got people who need you at home too." But I was focused on the mission, on keeping my soldiers alive, on living up to the example he'd set for me about duty and honor and sacrifice. I never realized that in his mind. And in the family's mind, I was sacrificing the wrong things. The morning after Karen's call, I began making careful preparations. Not for emergency leave, that option had been eliminated. For what came after, for the long-term consequences of my family's decision and my own response to it, I started with practical matters. I called my bank at Fort Stewart, spoke to a financial advisor about my accounts, combat pay, hazard duty pay, family separation allowance, basic allowance for subsistence. I'd been saving money for years without thinking much about it, automatically depositing most of my pay into savings accounts I rarely touched. Now I had a purpose for that money. I sent an encrypted message to my old squad leader, Staff Sergeant Thompson, who'd completed his enlistment 8 months earlier, was working construction in North Carolina, living in a trailer, trying to figure out civilian life. I asked him to start looking for property, something remote, something permanent, something where a soldier could disappear if necessary. I wrote a detailed letter to my company commander, Captain Rodriguez, explaining my family situation. I didn't send it immediately. Instead, I filed it away as documentation, evidence of my state of mind and the circumstances surrounding my grandfather's death, the kind of thing that might be relevant later if questions were asked about my decisions. I called my grandfather's next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She'd lived next to him for 35 years, had watched me grow up, knew the family dynamics better than anyone outside our immediate circle. I asked her to check on him during his final days, to make sure he wasn't suffering, to be a presence in his life when his own family had decided his grandson wasn't worthy of being there. "He's been asking for you, David," she said quietly. "Every day since he got sick. He doesn't understand why you won't come home. Your family keeps telling him you're too busy, that you have more important things to do than visit an old man. What exactly do they tell him? That you've changed, that the Army made you hard, that you care more about your career than your family, that you're too important now to worry about home." I thanked her and asked her to keep checking on him. Then I walked to the base chapel and sat in the back pew for an hour. Not praying exactly, but thinking about the man who'd raised me and the family that had decided I wasn't worth having around. The next day, I called my grandfather's lawyer, a family friend named Mr. Harrison who'd handled his affairs for 20 years. I didn't identify myself as the grandson, just as someone concerned about his welfare. Harrison was professional, but guarded clearly. Uncomfortable discussing a client's affairs with a stranger. "I can't provide details about Mr. Mitchell's situation," he said, "but I can tell you that his family is very involved in his care. His granddaughter Karen has been particularly attentive to his needs." Something in his tone made me press further. What kind of attention? "She's been helping manage his finances, his medical care, his daily needs. It's admirable, really. Not many young people would sacrifice so much for an elderly relative." After I hung up, I sat in my quarters and tried to process what I'd learned. Karen was managing Grandpa's affairs. It's Karen who'd dropped out of high school and had been fired from 3 jobs in 2 years. Karen, who'd asked me for money 6 months earlier to pay her rent. I started keeping a journal. Not for therapy or emotional processing, but for documentation. Dates, times, conversations, observations. The kind of detailed record-keeping that might be useful later if circumstances required it. Something was wrong. I couldn't prove it yet, but I could feel it. The same instinct that kept soldiers alive in combat zones was telling me that this situation was more complicated than a simple family disagreement about my priorities. The truth came out 2 weeks later, delivered by my grandfather's lawyer. In a phone call that changed everything, Mr. Harrison called me directly, his voice tight with what sounded like controlled anger. "Sergeant Mitchell, I need to ask you something directly," he said. "Did you authorize your sister Karen to manage your grandfather's financial affairs?" The question hit me like a sniper's bullet. Precise, unexpected, devastating in its implications. "What are you talking about?" She presented me with a power of attorney document last month. It gives her complete control over his assets, his medical decisions, everything. She said you'd requested it because you were too busy with military duties to handle family responsibilities. My blood turned to ice water. I never authorized anything like that. I suspected as much. The document looked legitimate, but something about it bothered me, so I had it examined by a handwriting expert. He paused. "Sergeant Mitchell, your signature on that document is forged." Jesus Christ, there's more. "Your sister has been intercepting your grandfather's mail, including letters from you. She's been telling him that you've stopped writing, that you're too busy with your military career to maintain contact with family." I closed my eyes and tried to process what he was telling me. How long has this been going on? At least 6 months? Maybe longer. She's been systematically isolating him from you while positioning herself as his primary caregiver. She's convinced him that you've abandoned him for your military career. What about his finances? She's been managing his accounts for 3 months. She's moved significant amounts of money, his savings, his pension, proceeds from selling some of his possessions. She told him you approved everything, that you wanted him to have the best possible care. How much money are we talking about? Your grandfather has accumulated substantial savings over the years. Nearly $400,000 in various accounts, plus the value of his property. Karen has already moved about $60,000 into accounts she controls. The scope of the betrayal was staggering. Karen hadn't just stolen money, she'd stolen my grandfather's final months with his grandson. She'd used my military service as a weapon against both of us, convincing him that I'd chosen duty over family while robbing him blind. "Mr. Harrison, what's my grandfather's mental state? Is he competent to understand what's happening?" "He has good days and bad days. The medication affects his clarity. But on his good days, he's sharp, asks about you constantly. He doesn't understand why you've stopped caring about him." "I haven't stopped caring. I've been deployed." "I know that." She's told him that you've been promoted to important positions, that you're too busy with your career to worry about family matters. She's made your military success sound like a betrayal of your relationship with him. I thanked Harrison and hung up. Then I walked outside and threw up behind the motor pool, my body finally reacting to the magnitude of what I'd learned. My sister had forged legal documents, stolen money from an elderly man, used my military service as justification for both crimes, and she'd done it all while convincing my grandfather that I was the one who'd abandoned him. The funeral wasn't about family disappointment. It was about covering up a crime. I spent the next 72 hours planning my response like a military operation, intelligence gathering, set assessment, strategic planning, legal research. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a criminal investigation, and I was going to approach it with the same systematic precision I'd use for any mission. First, I contacted the legal assistance office at Fort Stewart, Major Patricia Williams, a JAG officer who specialized in family law and military-related legal issues, listened to my story with the focused attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before. "Sergeant Mitchell, what you're describing constitutes multiple felonies," she said when I finished. "Identity theft, elder abuse, fraud involving forged documents. The fact that your sister used your military status to justify these crimes makes it even more serious. What are my options? You need to file criminal charges immediately. Can connect you with the appropriate civilian authorities. You'll also need to contest any legal documents she's filed using your forged signature. And you'll need to establish guardianship or conservatorship for your grandfather if he's not competent to protect himself. What about the military? Can they help? The Army takes crimes involving military members very seriously, especially when someone uses a soldier's status to commit fraud. I'll contact the Criminal Investigation Division. I want to interview you about the forged documents. I spent the next day gathering evidence. Had Harrison send me copies of all forged documents, all financial records, all correspondence related to my grandfather's affairs. I contacted Mrs. Patterson and asked her to document everything she'd observed about Karen's behavior and my grandfather's condition. She's been very controlling, Mrs. Patterson told me. She screens his phone calls, monitors his visitors, handles all his mail. She told me you'd given her permission to manage everything because you were too busy with your military career. What's his physical condition? Weak but alert. Still asks about you every day. Can't understand why you never call, why you never write. She's told him that you've been promoted to general and that you're too important now to worry about family. General. That's what she tells everyone. That you're a general now, that you're so successful in the Army that you don't have time for ordinary family concerns. She makes it sound like your success is a betrayal of your relationship with him. I called my company commander and requested emergency leave, not for a funeral, for a criminal investigation. Captain Rodriguez was understanding and supportive, especially after I explained the nature of the charges I was preparing to file. Take all the time you need, Sergeant, he said. This is exactly the kind of situation that emergency leave is designed for. I booked a flight home, not to attend a funeral I'd been banned from, but to confront a criminal who'd used my military service as cover for elder abuse. The war in Afghanistan would continue without me, but the war for my grandfathers. Dignity and legacy was just beginning. I flew home on a Tuesday, 28 hours of travel time across 3 continents, military transport to Germany, commercial flights to Atlanta, and then Charlotte. A rental car for the final 3-hour drive to my hometown. I went straight to the police station, Detective Sarah. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims. She listened to my story with the careful attention of someone who'd seen similar cases before, taking notes and asking pointed questions about timelines and evidence. This is a textbook elder abuse case, she said when I finished. The forged documents, the financial exploitation, the isolation from family members, your sister, followed a pattern we see regularly. The twist is that she used your military service as justification. What's the next step? We'll need to interview your grandfather to establish his mental competency and get his version of events. We'll examine the forged documents, review financial records, and build a case for the district attorney. How long will that take? Depends on your sister's cooperation. If she contests the charges, it could take months. If she pleads guilty, we might resolve it quickly. I called Harrison and arranged to meet with my grandfather. I hadn't seen him in 14 months, hadn't spoken to him in 3 weeks. The last time we'd talked, he'd sounded confused, distant. Now I knew why. The nursing home was depressing in the way that all institutional care facilities are depressing: fluorescent lighting, antiseptic smells, the sound of televisions echoing through corridors filled with people waiting to die. I found my grandfather in his room, staring out the window at a parking lot. Grandpa. He turned slowly, and I saw the confusion in his eyes, then recognition, then something like joy mixed with disbelief. David, is that really you? Yes, sir, I'm home. Karen said you were too busy. She said you'd been promoted too. General, and that you didn't have time for family anymore? I knelt beside his chair and took his hand. I'm not a general, Grandpa. I'm a staff sergeant, and I'm never too busy for you. But you stopped writing. You stopped calling. I never stopped writing. I never stopped calling. Karen was intercepting my letters. The confusion in his eyes deepened. I don't understand. Karen's been lying to you. She's been stealing your money and using my name to authorize it. She told you I'd proved everything because she knew you'd trust me. That's not possible. Karen's been taking care of me, she said. You asked her to handle everything because you were too busy with your military career. I spent 2 hours with him, gradually explaining what had happened. His mental clarity came and went, but during the lucid moments, he understood perfectly. The betrayal, the theft, the way his granddaughter had used his grandson's military service as a weapon against both of them. She made me believe you'd abandoned me, he said finally. She made me believe that becoming a general was more important to you than being my grandson. I'm not a general, Grandpa. I'm a staff sergeant. And even if I were a general, nothing would be more important than being your grandson. The next day, Karen was arrested. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Local woman charged with elder abuse, fraud. The article detailed how she'd forged military documents and used her brother's deployment as cover for systematically stealing from their grandfather. She called me from jail the next morning. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. I answered. On the third attempt, David, please. You don't understand. I was trying to help him by stealing his money, by making sure he had proper care. You were deployed. Someone had to make decisions. You didn't have to forge my signature. You didn't have to intercept my letters. You didn't have to convince him that I'd abandoned him. He was confused, David. He didn't understand that you'd moved on with your life. I never moved on. I never stopped caring. You made him think I had. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, will you help me? Can you talk to the prosecutor? We're family. You used my military service to justify stealing from our grandfather. You made an old man die thinking his grandson didn't care about him. You forged my signature and committed felonies in my name. David, you're not family anymore. Family doesn't do what you did. I hung up and blocked her number. My grandfather died 3 weeks later, peacefully in his sleep, with me holding his hand. His final weeks were spent in clarity, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him. We'd had time to reconcile, to understand what had happened, to say goodbye properly. The funeral was held on a Thursday morning in the small Methodist church where he'd worshipped for 60 years. I'd arranged for full military honors Marines from the local reserve unit, a flag-draped casket, the ceremony he'd earned through his service in World War II. The church was packed, veterans from 3 wars, neighbors who remembered his kindness, friends who'd known him as a man of integrity. Karen was still in jail, awaiting trial. Most of the extended family stayed away, embarrassed by the scandal, comfortable with the truth about what had happened. During the service, I delivered a eulogy that focused on his character, his service, his commitment to family. I talked about the lessons he'd taught me, the example he'd set, the way he'd understood that duty and love weren't contradictory, but complementary. As the service concluded, I noticed 12 Marines in dress blues standing at attention near the back of the church. I didn't recognize any of them. They looked young, probably reservists from the local unit. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed, their senior member approached me. General Mitchell. I looked at him with confusion. I'm not a general. I'm a staff sergeant. Yes, sir. But your grandfather told everyone you were a general. He was so proud of you, sir. He used to come to our meetings at the VFW and tell stories about his grandson, the general. The Marine's expression was serious, respectful. We're from the local reserve unit. We wanted to pay our respects to you and to honor your grandfather's memory. Before I could respond, all 12 Marines came to attention and rendered a perfect salute. Not the casual acknowledgement you might give to a staff sergeant, but the crisp, formal salute reserved for general officers. General, sir, they said in unison. I understood then what had happened, in his pride and his love and his desire to share his grandson's achievements. My grandfather had promoted me from staff sergeant to general. He'd told everyone about his grandson, the general, about how proud he was of my service, about how I was serving my country at the highest levels. Karen had used that pride against him, telling him that my success had made me too important for family. But these Marines understood something different. They understood that a grandfather's pride in his grandson's service was sacred, regardless of rank. They understood that, in the heart of a man who'd served his country, his grandson's commitment to duty made him worthy of respect. I returned their salute with the dignity the moment required. Then I watched them file out of the church, their duty completed, their respect rendered. 6 months later, I completed my deployment and took terminal leave. I'd decided not to re-enlist. 20 years of service was enough. I used my grandfather's restored inheritance to buy a small house near Fort Bragg. It was close enough to the base to feel connected to military life, but far enough away to build something. Knew Karen was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The judge was particularly harsh about the way she'd used my military service as cover for her crimes. "You didn't just steal from an elderly man," he said during sentencing. "You used your brother's honorable service to our country as a weapon against both of them." I kept my grandfather's metal box on my mantel, next to a photograph of him in his World War II uniform. I also kept the last letter he'd written to me. It's dictated to a nurse during his final week. "David, I know now what really happened. I know Karen lied to both of us. I want you to know that I never stopped being proud of you. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped believing that you were doing the right thing by serving your country. You're not a general, but you're my grandson. And that's more important than any rank. Come home when you can. I'll be waiting, love." Grandpa had kept that letter in my wallet and read it whenever I doubted myself. Whenever I wondered if I'd made the right choices, he'd understood what others couldn't, that sometimes love means serving something bigger than yourself, something more important than comfort or convenience. Last month, I got a letter from one of my former soldiers. He's married now, has a daughter, works as a police officer in Tennessee. He thanked me for keeping him alive, for teaching him what it means to lead, to serve, to sacrifice for something greater than your own immediate desires. I wrote him back and told him that's what soldiers do. We serve, we sacrifice, come home. When we can, the family said, I failed. They banned me from the funeral. They thought military service was an excuse for abandoning responsibility. They were wrong about everything except one thing. I had chosen duty over comfort. I had chosen service over convenience. I had chosen honor over ease. My grandfather understood that choice. In the end, he was the only one whose opinion mattered. When those 12 Marines saluted me at his funeral, they weren't saluting my rank. They were saluting the choice I'd made, the choice he'd taught me to make. The choice that had cost me a family, but given me something more valuable than knowledge, that I'd lived up to the example he'd set. They called me General. Sir, because in the heart of a grandfather who'd served his country, his grandson's commitment to duty had earned the highest honor he could imagine. They understood that rank is just a number, but service is eternal. That's what soldiers do. We serve, we sacrifice, we come home when we can. And sometimes we find that the people who truly understand the cost of service have been waiting to honor us all along.